John, thank you so much for joining me today.
Really good to be with you.
You coined a term in the book called the 21st century fires. What exactly does this mean?
Well, it means a few things. I think a number of fire scientists and climate scientists are all recognizing that we're entering a new era. Stephen Pine, kind of the eminence grise, the granddaddy of fire science, calls it the Pyrocene age. But 21st century fire is basically bigger, faster, hotter, more destructive, harder to suppress. That's the short answer.
Your book, Fire Weather, it is in three different parts, and it tells the story of the Fort McMurray fire of 2016. I feel strange even calling it a fire because it was much more than that. Before we get into the conversation about that fire, what is the significance of Fort McMurray in the context of oil imports around the world?
Well, it's the biggest source of foreign imports into the United States. It's about 4 million barrels a day of petroleum products coming out of Fort Mac, which is almost 1,000 kilometers north of the U.S. border. And it's really not oil that they're transporting through pipelines. It's diluted bitumen, and bitumen is basically tar. It's what you use to seal your driveway, and it requires an enormous amount of intervention, including a lot of heat generated by natural gas in order to render it into something that specially designed U.S. refineries and some in Edmonton can process. So it's a very different animal, if you will, than what's coming out of Saudi Arabia or the Gulf of Mexico. And the fact that it is basically comes out of a giant sand dune um, makes it even more difficult to render. There's not a lot of pumping involved. We can talk about SAGD if you want, but we can. It's easy to get into the weeds there, but it's technical. It's extraordinarily energy intensive, and it's probably the most environmentally destructive petroleum product being developed or accessed today.
Before we talk about the book a little bit further, I know one thing that you do in the setup to this story is talk about a bit of the history of Fort McMurray. How did this place come to be this center that it's known as today when it comes to oil imports, as well as bitumen, and a little bit about that history?
Yeah, the first big extraction project in Canada was beaver furs, and the Athabasca River, northern Alberta, that region had what were considered to be in the 18th century the finest beaver pelts in the country, which is saying something. And the numbers of beavers that came out of there, including through the trading post at Fort McMurray, which was founded 150 years ago, in 1870, 175 years ago, were legendary. Tens of hundreds of thousands of pelts were taken out of there by hand, killed by hand, and then transported by canoe back to Montreal and then shipped to the UK and Europe for hat manufacturing. So as those traders discovered these seeps of bitumen and also little bubblings up of natural gas. And they had no idea what the value of those things would be, but they took note. And later, petroleum prospectors returned to that area and started trying to extract it. And it's really one of the most difficult projects undertaken by Canadian extractors. There was an enormous amount of US help, US money. It's almost, you could say, a US project. And it still is to this day. There's a lot of foreign ownership in the tar sands, also known as the oil sands. So it they started probably a century ago trying to render this stuff. And again, it's bitumen soaked in sand, a really stubborn material. They definitely have to get kudos for persistence and just the huge amount of sort of heartbreaking energy that was exerted to try to turn this into money, into something that could be burned. And eventually, starting in the 60s, they got it online, kind of mainstreamed it with a lot of help from Sunoco. That's the Sun Oil company, J. Howard Pugh out of the US. And Syncrude followed, and then other big oil majors from the US, Canada, and around the world jumped in. And now it's consolidating back into mostly Canadian owned companies, but those Canadian companies have a lot of foreign ownership. So it's really a kind of an international project.
It's interesting when I was starting to read your book. I suppose that I wanted to believe that the destruction wasn't as intense as it actually was. But when you read about these early days in Fort McMurray and the upheaval of entire forests and the machinery that they're using to dig up these amazing trees that are hundreds and hundreds of years old, I mean, that is something that I wonder today, could that even happen in the context of so much social media around and people paying attention? But it feels to me like it was a time where did people just turn a blind eye to what was taking place?
Amber, people are turning a blind eye right now. The forest is still being cleared. The river is still being polluted. The huge tailings ponds that cover many, many square miles of destroyed forest are still expanding. It's around 1,000 square miles of forest have been totally destroyed, cleared off, stripped out, and mined. And the tailings ponds, which are basically hold effluent from this melting, diluting, upgrading process that is, again, incredibly energy intensive to the tune of billions of cubic feet of natural gas every day, every week being burned in order to simply to liquefy and separate this bitumen from the sand. This is ongoing to this day. Even after the fire, which shut this, evacuated the city, the largest, most rapid evacuation due to fire in modern times, and shut down this multi-billion-dollar industry for many weeks. They've now expanded since then, and they've built the city back exactly the way it was before. And on they go. So this is not something that's in the past. It's not from a less enlightened time. It's still going and still has ambitious plans to grow even bigger. And there's really, there's going to be no fixing it whenever they finally stop.
Let's talk about The Making of a Beast. This is the subtitle of your book and the events surrounding the 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire, which caused billions of dollars in damage, essentially melted vehicles, as I learned in the book, more than 80,000 people driven from their homes. So, walk us through this without maybe taking everything away in terms of the tremendous amount of detail in the book. What happened? Why was this sort of a perfect storm in some ways in terms of seeing a wildfire of this significance?
So Alberta has been in semi-drought conditions for a number of years. The rainfall and snowpack have dropped off considerably, double-digit percentages year over year. And the boreal forest, which is this enormous ecosystem in northern Canada, runs from coast to coast. It's the wettest biome on Earth, wetter than the tropical jungle, is drying out. And so you have these already flammable places. The boreal burns naturally. It's how it regenerates itself. But these fires now, because it's drier, because it's hotter up there now than it used to be, these fires burn more intensely. And on May 3rd, 2016, there were 5 different wildfires burning in and around Fort McMurray. The temperature record for that day was broken by 6 degrees Celsius. The relative humidity was comparable to Death Valley. And these fires, under those conditions, really stopped being fires and turned into explosive firestorms. And there was ample warning. There was long range forecasting, short range forecasting, hourly forecasting, all of which was impeccable. So the meteorologists did their job, fire scientists did their job, but this fire was completely overwhelming to firefighters. The amount of energy being released, the speed with which it moved, the incredible heat it was generating. So these fires, it was basically a wall of flame, roughly 50 to 100 meters tall, 10 kilometers wide, that swept into the southwest side of the city, basically like a wave. And the heat coming off the leading edge of these fires is absolutely face meltingly ferocious. It's basically degrees Fahrenheit, 500 degrees Celsius. That's hotter than the planet Venus. It desiccates everything in front of it and then elevates it beyond combustive temperatures. And so when you exert that kind of thermal energy on a modern house, vinyl siding, plastic swing set, rubber tires, tar shingles, all those petroleum products, because that's what they are, start to off gas. And so now what you have over the city is this cloud of explosive gas. And that's why houses in Fort McMurray, $750,000, 50-ton structures burnt from the roof to the basement in 6 minutes. And I did not believe this when firefighters told me. And I interviewed a lot of firefighters who were trying to fight this fire against all odds, really, all over the city. And I heard 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. And I eventually got on board with them because they were timing it on their watches. And these houses were burning in ways that none of them had ever seen before. And water has no effect on heat like that. It doesn't matter if it's coming from a water bomber or a water hose. All they could do is try to get as many people out as they could and then run for their lives and try to save their fire trucks.
I wanted to ask you about this because when I was reading the book, you talk about some of this advanced firefighting infrastructure, technology, training. I mean, when we look at Fort McMurray, they have all of these things. Most people may think, okay, well, they are well equipped to deal with a fire like this. But like you said, it appears as though, they couldn't even make a dent in what happened in 2016.
And what makes that even more sobering is the fact that a lot of this equipment is designed for petrochemical fires because these upgraders and these facilities, these bitumen processing facilities, are explosive, flammable, dangerous places. And so you have very well trained firefighters with state of the art equipment to deal with explosive petrochemical fires. And they brought that equipment to bear on the fires in Fort McMurray. And really, the best they could do is create water curtains around places that hadn't burned yet. But they could not put out fires that had already ignited. And so they had to resort to increasingly radical measures to try to control the spread of this fire, including bulldozing brand new homes to try to basically make a fire break through the neighborhood. And that was, those are some amazing interviews with the backhoe operators and bulldozer operators who were working on day 3 and day 4 of this fire, burning night and day through the city, trying to basically save neighborhoods by destroying them. It really was over the top and unprecedented. And some measures were successful, but we lost, I think, 2,500 homes, and many thousands more were severely damaged by heat and water and shrapnel from exploding objects. It was really like a war zone in there.
I want people to get their own copy of the book to read all of the details of what happened, all the interviews that you did for the book. One of the things that really surprised me is that I think I would have assumed that maybe the fire was burning for a few days or a few weeks, but that was not the case. This fire was burning for many, many months.
This fire broke all kinds of records. In terms of burning inside the city limits of Fort McMurray, it was in there for a good 5 or 6 days. In other words, firefighters were actively putting out fires within the city limits. And that's pretty much unprecedented outside of the realm of really famous historic fires like the Great Fire of London in 1666 and the Great Edo Fire in what's now Tokyo, Japan, and I think it was 1753, but you have to go way back to find a fire burning in city limits for day and night for that long. But it burnt through the forest to the tune of, I just know the miles, 2,500 square miles of forest were burnt in the Fort McMurray fire. And it burnt all through the fall. It went underground in the winter. It reemerged the next spring and was not declared officially out until August of 2017. That's 15 months after it ignited.
I read an interview you did in the Review of Journalism where you said, I'm going to quote you, this is a national problem. It's a national security problem and national safety problem. It's also a social justice problem. Look at who's influenced the most, impacted the most by intense heat, by fire evacuations. Could you expand on this to put it into context for our listeners insofar as how it affects all of us?
Well, the sad fact is any city in Canada can now burn the way Fort McMurray did. And Fort Vancouver, where I live, very nearly had a catastrophic fire just last August. I wrote about it for the Globe and Mail in an op-ed piece. That fire started inside the city, but it very nearly got away from firefighters. And the entire Vancouver Fire Department was completely maxed out by two fires that ignited that night. So we're because of elevated heat, because of drought, because of the impacts of heat domes, in which a couple of years ago we lost the town of Lytton, BC, in 45 minutes, killing two people. We are all much more vulnerable than we used to be. And when I say social justice, these fires, the Fort McMurray is a wealthy community, highest per capita income pretty much in the country. But that doesn't mean there aren't vulnerable people there. And that doesn't mean there aren't communities around Fort McMurray that don't have that kind of income. Indigenous communities, settler communities, combinations where people are living much closer to the bone. And when you lose your home or when you're evacuated, that means you're not working. That means you're dealing with enormous anxiety. And this is, this kind of invisible, there's a couple of kind of companions to fire that we don't factor in as much. And smoke is a really big one. It's P2. These P2 particles that come out of wood smoke burning trees and houses are demonstrably toxic to human beings. And Canada has been generating a lot of this through its burning fires. I think we've burnt about 6 million hectares this fire season alone, which is massive. On top of that, you have the anxiety and the stress and the trauma of seeing a massive fire come into your town, which is really one of the most terrifying things a human being can experience. And one way to think about this is 10 years ago, if we had asked Amber and PEI where you are, or Vancouver where I am, if we'd asked our friends, who do we know who's been evacuated due to fire or put on alert? Those would be very patchy numbers. And it would be uneven across the country. Now, I bet every single Canadian, from PEI to Vancouver Island to Newfoundland, knows somebody who's been evacuated or been put on alert. So that's the country we live in now. And the other piece of data that really should sober all of us is I did a couple of keynotes for Red Cross Canada last year, talking to the CEO, Conrad Sauvé, and he told me when he started working for Red Cross Canada, about 80% of their work was done outside the country, which is what you would expect of a wealthy, generous country like Canada. Most of its relief work would be done outside the country. That was 15 or 20 years ago. Now, 80% of Red Cross relief work is done inside Canada. So it's a
Wow.
different country now. We are having our own crises that the Red Cross, normally one of our greatest exports, is now being tied up inside the country, dealing with floods, fires, and storms that are growing in intensity and impacting more people more grievously. And the fallout from that, besides displacement, lost income, lost property, is trauma. And PTSD, I would say, is now a national epidemic as a result of these traumatic fires and floods. They're really, really frightening to experience, really tough on children, really tough on families.
I think that's absolutely true. And, not specific to wildfires, but here on Prince Edward Island, when the island was hit by Hurricane Fiona just a few years ago,
Right.
you also don't hear those stories that have an impact on individuals and communities and maybe don't make it to mainstream media or to social media. So, for
Right.
example, on Prince Edward Island, even my own family who lives in a coastal community, my mom wasn't impacted during the storm, but because of all the trees that fell, and then she was cleaning up her yard, and then she tripped over some of the debris and broke her shoulder, and then there were
Yeah.
weeks and weeks of rehabilitation. It strikes
Yeah.
me that people don't think about these stories, like you say, sort of the aftermath of the impact of some of these storms and wildfires, because those stories aren't going to make the news. But this is months and months of issues, whether it's PTSD or injury or people out of work to these communities.
Yeah. Couldn't agree with you more. And it takes so many different forms. And, we talk about gifts that keep on giving. Well, these disasters keep on taking. And the recovery exposes people like your mother to hazards, but also electricians and builders and earth movers are all exposed. Another thing that happens commonly after big fires, especially out west, is flooding. The trees are now dead. The roots are no longer holding the soil. The chemical composition of the soil can actually be changed by the intensity of the fire. And then when the next flood comes, the roots aren't there to hold the soil. So you can lose whole mountainsides and valleys. And they go into the river, they foul the river, they destroy the fish habitat. So this can go on for years following a fire that might have taken a week or a month or a few months to burn. So there's this cascade effect, human and natural, on our country that's ongoing right now.
What about the large corporations? How much responsibility do they bear when it comes to disasters like this, whether it's a wildfire or another issue that's taking place in our country? What would you say about the impact that these big businesses are having on the health of our communities and our climate as well?
That's really a conversation for a whole new episode, Amber. I mean, the mining industry is very culpable in terms of the types of kind of unofficial dams that they are building all over the West that are actually not very well built, prone to bursting, and do enormous damage when they break down. Likewise, the petroleum industry, which has understood the impacts it has on climate. It has understood the danger it poses to planetary health and human health literally since the 1950s. And yet, governments, banks, insurance companies, investors have enabled them for decades, for our entire lives, despite the fact that we know uh, very well the impacts of CO2 and methane on our climate. And we are now feeling the impacts of that retained heat and poisoned air. And it's really impacting the quality of life of human beings in general and Canadians in particular. We are, the Canadian mean average temperature is rising twice as fast as the global average because our country is so far north. So climate change impacts are pronounced the further into the Arctic you go. And so we are, because we're up there, we are warming more quickly. And you can see it in the fires and you can see it in the drought. And, look at the fire and drought map for Alberta for today. Most of the province is in orange and red. And those are colors you do not want to see on your maps.
What lessons have we learned then when we talk about the story of what took place in Fort McMurray? That again was back in 2016. That's almost a decade ago. What have we learned from a fire like this, and has anything changed?
Some things have changed, but not in Alberta, and not in Texas, and not in Florida, and now not in Washington, D.C., where they are in active climate denial, minimizing the risks and refusing to acknowledge the science that points directly toward fossil fuels in terms of the hazards we find ourselves facing every day in terms of rising temperatures and all those, the effects of that. So, there's what have we learned? I think people who are paying attention have learned that we need to have more than one exit route from our community. And there are a lot of new developments all across Canada that only have one road in and one road out, and that road can be blocked by fire. And then you can have a fire trap and you can lose a lot of lives. I think we're learning in some communities where there is Fire Smart, which is a really wonderful project that is, I don't think it's in every Canadian province and territory, but it's in many of the fire prone ones. And here we can have firefighters come to our community, to our neighborhood, our cul-de-sac, our own backyard, and look at it through the lens of fire vulnerability. And so there's a lot that citizens can do, and there's a lot that citizens are doing in fire prone areas to harden their gardens and neighborhoods against fire. There's a lot you can do for very little money or no money at all that can reduce the chances of destructive fire really by double-digit percentages. But these are stopgap measures. And what we really need is a government who is bold enough to face the threat climate poses and to lean aggressively into renewable energy, which is solar is the cheapest source of energy ever devised. And right now, China is running away with the future of energy. They own the renewables industry. They own the EV industry. BYD, a company many of your listeners may have never heard of, is the biggest EV car company in the world. China, the nation, is installing about 1.5 gigawatts of renewable energy every day. A gigawatt will power 750,000 to 1 million homes. And Canada is not doing that. Canada could do that. Canada could be a renewable energy superpower. We have infinite sun, infinite wind, infinite geothermal, 3 oceans worth of tidal, and abundant rivers. And we could power the nation and sell the rest to the US if we decided that was a national project that we wanted to engage in. And Canadians are capable of powerful, concerted action that makes a difference. And this is the difference we need to see in the 21st century.
Just as you're speaking, it reminds me, I was doing some research before our conversation. There was a headline in the Wall Street Journal in 2024 that said, pump more oil or reduce emissions. Canada tries to do both and angers everyone. And I think about this all the time. Now, at the time, it was a different leader in power in Canada. Of course, we've recently had a federal election and we have new leadership. We see Prime Minister Carney saying that Canada, like you said, can be a clean energy superpower. I too want to believe this. I read your book and I thought we need this now more than ever. I've constantly been talking about clean tech for homes, things like heat pumps and solar. At the same time, maybe I'm just a little nervous about the future that we're going into because of the power of some of these massive corporations. And also, I think there's a rise in misinformation and disinformation that we're seeing online that is sort of polluting the environment in terms of what is the truth around climate. How do you see things faring in the months to come? Do you think that there is potential that we can reach that goal of being a clean energy superpower? Or are there too many strong forces at play here that are going to distract us from that goal?
And right now, the petroleum industry has a disproportionate, really an unwholesome impact on our political system. That if you just look at the lobbying hours in Ottawa, and the fossil fuel industry outpaces any other energy source by orders of magnitude. And Alberta wields a kind of sort of has a kind of intimidation factor that is disproportionate to its the actual role that it plays. And it's very hard for Ottawa to please Alberta under any circumstances. the fact about Alberta is it's filled with very skilled workers. It's a great place to expand wind and solar. It's a really sunny place. It's a really windy place full of people who want to work hard and are capable of technically sophisticated work and an amazing work ethic. So I don't see why Alberta, objectively couldn't actually lead the charge into renewables for Canada and really for North America. Right now, interestingly, Texas, really the twin sister of Alberta in the southern United States, is leading the entire continent in wind and solar. And Texas is oil country. It's very conservative. They have an official policy of climate denial. There are lots of really frightening things happening there politically and socially, but they understand the value of wind and solar. They know how to work. It's not that hard to install, and they're installing gigawatts worth of it. Not as fast as China, but they are leading even California, which would be the state you would expect to be the leader. But Texas is ahead of them. And that should tell Albertans something, and it should tell Canadians something.
Just a couple more questions for you, and thank you for being so generous with your time. I'm curious, after you write a book like Fire Weather and you go through this process of talking to so many people, learning so much about what happened back in 2016, what led up to the making of this beast of a fire, what does this do to you in terms of changing your perspective and purpose?
Well, it turned my hair gray, Amber. I'm not kidding.
Really? Sorry, I shouldn't laugh.
It's no, it's really okay. It was worth it. But I saw things and heard things that I can't unsee and can't unhear while researching that book. And that's one reason I'm still talking about it 2 years later is I really don't want people to endure the trauma that people in Fort McMurray did, that people in Redding, California, which I also write about. These it does terrible damage to people and their property. And it was heartbreaking, the conversations I had with people in Fort McMurray who mercifully survived. Most of them survived the fire, thank goodness. But it left a mark. And, I really don't want to see that continue. So the other is I'm amazed the fact that people still want to talk about this really quite difficult and scary subject. I really can understand why people want to look the other way, why people don't want to deal with this. And the fact is, I've been touring and doing interviews with wonderful people like you literally for more than 2 years, all over the world. And people are bravely want to engage with this. And because they see the threat, it's real and it's present and it's right now. And look at the news. There's a flood or a fire every day somewhere, and they're getting bigger and worse. And the U.S. has had its worst flooding year in many decades, and there's a lot. We're barely halfway through the year, so there's a lot to come. So I really admire people, and I'm grateful for their willingness to engage with me on what's a hard, scary subject. But really, I think the only way through is by dealing with it. And we really do have viable solutions, affordable solutions, and a lot of people who have the skill to build this infrastructure that's needed. And it's happening in kind of fits and starts around the continent and around the world. But there's a lot of positive news out there in terms of the direction this energy transition is going in some communities. And there's an enormous amount we can do as individuals and as voters to shift the narrative in a more wholesome and future-oriented and healthy direction. And that's what I'm here for.
Last question for you. You say there's lots we can do as individuals. I think that's one question that people always have top of mind is what can I do today? And I totally agree about shifting the narrative. One of the things that I'm trying to do on a small scale is just tell the truth about some of these options that exist out there and try to get people to weed through all of the misinformation and disinformation that does exist. What can individuals do to move us in a healthier direction. And I just want to add a little footnote there. When we talk about this transition that we're going through, it's not, of course, just to ensure that we have a brighter future. It's also, in many cases, a more cost effective future. We know affordability is top of mind for so many Canadians,
Yeah.
and this offers affordability, some of this clean tech that exists out there. So, what can individuals do to help push us forward?
Well, the first would be to vote for candidates who recognize the threat climate change poses to our communities directly. The other is to uh, look at how we can make our own neighborhoods and own houses less vulnerable to fire. So that's kind of at the crudest safety level. In terms of energy, um, the heat pump is a viable option. It's an relatively inexpensive option. Any new technology is going to cost some money. None of us had smartphones in 2006, and most of us will shell out 500 to $1,000. We'll buy them for our kids now. That's technology that works for people, and we've found a way to integrate it into our lives and found a way to afford it. Heat pumps will heat and cool your homes, and they work in Canada, and they work in really cold climates. And they work in hot climates, and Canada can produce both. The heat pump can, in almost every situation, accommodate both, and it's much cheaper to operate. So once you've got it installed, and they're really quiet, and they're much cleaner. So there are lots of pluses there. Obviously, um, the EV is another new expense, but a lot of people buy new cars. And rather than buying a new gasoline car, to get a new electric car is, a really viable option. Most of the people I know who have these vehicles really like them. And we are in a very exciting stage of history in terms of battery development. We're really at the beginning stages, but they're becoming much more efficient, much cleaner, much longer lasting. And so, the range, of an electric vehicle is growing every year, and the number of charging stations is also growing. And the fact that we can now charge from our homes is amazing. And the fact that a lot of us get our power from hydropower means that you can really run a clean vehicle. It's not a coal-fired generator that's powering your electric car. It's hydropower. And if you have solar, you can literally power it off the sun. And people are doing this. This isn't a pie in the sky fantasy that crazy people in Southern California are doing. People in Canada can do this. And in many parts of the country, we have the sun, we have the infrastructure to do it. So, and it means being a little bit brave and a little bit adventurous, but kind of like the smartphone, once you have it, it's really hard to imagine life without it. And it's an exciting possibility. And it's an adventure, and a lot of people are going on it with good results and feeling good about it. So that excites me.
Absolutely. John, thank you so much for writing this book. And thank you so much for spending so much time with me today. I really appreciate it. Looking forward to the next book. And thank you
Mm.
so much for joining us on the show.
Amber, what a joy to speak with you. Thanks for having me on.